but if you were in the first class, I said a lot of some positive things about Catholic Church in the Middle Ages because they were the civilizing force of the Middle Ages. You know, the university system was created by them, and advances in science came through the Catholic Church and all that. But one of the reasons that things sound so bad is because it was very corrupt at the time of the Protestant Reformation, and so you get into the Protestant Reformation. Of course, we talked about Martin Luther, and he was not planning on starting a revolution in Europe. He just disagreed with the doctrine of indulgences at first. And if the Catholic Church had simply said, okay, you're right, Martin Luther, and changed it, then there may not have been a Protestant Reformation at that time. But that's a lesson, you know, you can be pretty hard-headed and refuse to change anything. But Luther got more and more revolted, more and more things, and challenged the institution of the papacy itself, and so on. And then there was a Protestant Reformation movement in Switzerland, a little bit further south, and so they came about almost at the same time, but it was just a little bit after what Martin Luther did in Germany. And the leader of that was Ulrich Zwingli, okay? And it was one of the reasons that Luther survived is because he had the protection of one of the kings of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick. And so the reason that Ulrich Zwingli was able to do what he did is in Switzerland, they didn't have a king. They had these little republics, as you will. And the city council oftentimes was the highest level of government in Switzerland, you know, and they'd be in these little cantons and everything. Well, so he was able to do quite a bit because he had the protection of the government there in Switzerland. And he moved further than Luther, really. And they tried to unite their two movements, but neither one would give on, like they agreed on, like on 38 of 39 points, but they couldn't agree on was the Lord's Supper, did the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood? Well, that was the Catholic position, transubstantiation. Luther modified it to, well, it didn't become his body and his blood, but he was present in the elements. And Zwingli said, no, it's symbolic, okay? It's a memorial. And so they went their separate ways, okay? And then there was another group that I cover at this point at the time was the Anabaptists. And they were also became important in Switzerland, and they were part of the Zwingli movement at first, but they wanted to go even further than Zwingli did, and the biggest point of difference between Zwingli and the Anabaptists was, see, here's your quiz from last week. What was the distinctive? There were two distinctives about the Anabaptists. Okay, believer's baptism, and the other was complete religious liberty, that the government should have no say over your religious practices. And so Zwingli, of course, he did not go with the believer's baptism because the city council, they had all been infant baptized, and their children had all been infant baptized, and so they weren't going to change. And so Zwingli made a decision, I think a pragmatic decision, you can say he's right or wrong on this, that he was going to not go that way, okay? And so they split, and the Anabaptists become their own thing. And so let's look now. We're on bottom of page 3. We're going to be talking about the Anabaptists tonight. And okay, so he did come to class prepared. Okay. Okay, so there were these two preachers in Zurich, Conrad Grebel and Felix Mons. Okay, and they were Anabaptists, and they held that infant baptism was unscriptural. They said they could find nothing in Scripture where any infant, which was a non-believer, right, by definition, because they couldn't believe anything, there's no Scripture you could find where that was done. And then Zwingli had another friend named Balthasar Hümeyer, who revealed that Zwingli actually sympathized with the Anabaptist position, but he just couldn't because he'd lose his protection of the city council. Same thing as Luther. I think he did not support the peasants' revolt. Remember we talked about last week, because that would have lost the support of the king and the nobles, and he needed that support against the Catholic Church. And then Zwingli, the city council, and so forth. And so many Anabaptists came to believe that earthly power commanding religious matters was contrary to the Word of God. That the government should have no authority to dictate anything in religion. So today, now we'll talk about what's the connection of modern Baptists with these Anabaptists. Today, those are the two distinctives of Baptists that make them different from practically anybody else, is these two things. Other churches have adopted believers' baptism and believe in religious liberty, but they were kind of the first. And I think they're intertwined if you think about it, that everybody should have a choice on what they do. But 1525, they were, we don't know exactly when they started this believer's baptism, but by 1525 they were doing that, and they were nicknamed the Anabaptists, which means against baptism, because they were rebaptizers. So the Zurich government came to oppose in 1526, issued an order for Anabaptists who persisted in this heretical belief to be drowned. Now, the reason they chose drowning was they said they called it the third baptism, because you baptize as an infant, you're baptized as a believer, and you like it so much, we're going to baptize you for a third time, only we're going to hold you under a little longer. So Hümeyer, he moved up into southwest Germany, and he wrote that the Bible was the sole law for the church. He believed that preaching of the word, hearing, belief, baptism, works was the natural progression. And I think there's a verse in Scriptures where Paul says, how are they going to believe if they haven't heard? How are they going to hear without a preacher? That's where they got that. So you preach the word, you share the gospel, somebody hears it, they believe, then they're baptized, then they do good works. You can't be saved by good works. Good works are a result of being saved. So we'll get into more of that later. Now, one more thing I'll say about the Anabaptists differed with all the reformers that we're going to talk about, in that there was they believe, the Catholic Church didn't believe in the visible church, obviously, but the difference was the Anabaptist concept of the visible church was in the form of congregations. You put the aggregate of all these congregations together, and that's the church. Okay, and they believe there was some sort of every Christian was part of the universal church, a body of Christ. Now, talking about some of these with the persecution, there was one guy named Dirk Willems, and he was an Anabaptist, and he got arrested, and they put him in prison. And while he was in prison, somehow he escaped. It was wintertime. They hadn't been feeding him very well, so he was pretty light. Okay, so he starts running, and the jailer's chasing him. Now, the jailer's heavier, and he's Dirk Willems is getting further and further away, and the little pond, there was a pond, and it was frozen over, where Dirk Willems keeps on running, and he can run across the pond because he's light. Well, this jailer comes along behind him, and he doesn't make it. He gets out in the middle, and plow, he goes right through the ice, and he's trying to keep him going under. He's trying to grab on, and he's screaming, "Help! Somebody help me!" And Dirk Willems turned around and went back and pulled him up out of the water, and the guy grabbed him, took him back to the prison, and they burned him at the stake. Okay. Hubmaier fled torture in Zurich, and he went to Moravia. Now, this is sort of like the early Christians. They started being persecuted, so it's kind of spread the gospel that way, as they just took it with them. And so this spread the movement up into Moravia. Now, that's kind of like where the Czech Republic is today. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And so they drew up 1527, some 7 articles of faith, believers' baptism. Churches were only associations of baptized, experiential Christians. Now, what do you think they meant by experiential Christians? Yeah, they had a Christian experience. Okay, they didn't just grow up in a church home and all that kind of stuff. They were united by common observance of the Lord's Supper. Excommunication was their only weapon for people who weren't following things. Each congregation would choose its own officers, which they designated as pastors and deacons. They believed civil government was necessary. This is kind of interesting. They thought Christians should avoid government. Now, you have to understand the times, okay, that they lived in. They weren't a democratic society. They weren't going to have elections. They weren't going to be able to change anything. So even though they believed God had created the institution of government, they believed it's just better to avoid it as much as possible. And you can understand when they're drowning you and burning you at the stake, that they might want to do that. Okay, the ideas of the Anabaptists were largely adopted eventually by Baptists and Congregationalists and Quakers, Moravians, and Mennonites. Now, let me tell you who some of these people are. The Congregationalists, we're going to talk about them. In England, they were known as the Separatists, and we'll talk about the Separatists later on. The Quakers, John Dink was a leading Quaker, and he believed that the inner spirit was superior to the Scriptures, and that a Christian could live without sin. And that's kind of the holiness, thing that we'll talk about that later as well. Now, even though these were views of the Anabaptists, there were some medieval sects that held at least some of these views. Remember, I talked about how all through the Middle Ages there were people that didn't accept the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church and all that. Well, one of these groups was called the Waldenses, and they were found by Peter Waldo, and they were persecuted. They were always persecuted if they didn't accept, the Catholic Church deal. And so they were trying to find Peter Waldo. He was the founder. And they looked all over Europe for Peter Waldo because they were going to take care of him. And they kept going, "Where's Waldo?" Okay. And they never did find him. Okay. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Uh, they also held to what we would call premillennialism. And one of the things about the reformers, whether it's Luther or Calvin or Zwingli, all these guys, they didn't really talk too much about uh, what we would call eschatology, the doctrine of final things like heaven and hell and the second coming and how that's all going to be and so forth, because their focus was on what we call soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. Okay, and but as I said, many of these medieval sects held some of these views, and one of them was premillennialism. This is the belief that Christ would return and set up a literal 1,000-year earthly reign. Okay, that's called premillennialism. Now, I'm going to go to my prize student here, Larry Hall, then. And so, Larry, what the belief that Christ would return after the millennium, what do you think that was called? Postmillennialism. Okay. And then there were some, the Catholic Church, it's kind of vague what they really thought in the Middle Ages, but um, it's something is either postmillennialism or all millennialism, that the all that there wasn't really a earthly millennium, it was a spiritual concept. And that goes to a guy by the name of Augustine. And he lived around 400. And he wrote The City of God. And he proposed that the millennium that's talked about in the book of Revelation was on earth through the Catholic Church. You follow what he's saying, that Christ is going to rule through the Catholic Church for 1,000 years. From what I have read, Augustine took the 1,000 years to be literal, that it would really be 1,000 years. But as it turns out, as time went on and it didn't, nothing happened, they just kind of said, well, they spiritualized it. They said, well, it's just a concept, that don't worry about it. Jesus is ruling through the church, and who runs the Catholic Church? The Pope. So if you disagree with the Pope, you're disagreeing with Jesus himself. Okay. So why would you think Anabaptists, what I've told you about them so far, why do you think they would be premillennial? Well, they rejected that idea that the Catholic Church was ruling for Christ. Isn't that kind of logical? That since otherwise they'd be what? Catholics. Okay, they wouldn't have revolted, and so that's kind of the way that was. Now they were persecuted by both Roman Catholics and Protestants. Different levels. Hubmaier, for example, was burned at the stake, and his wife was drowned. They were going to be a little nicer to her because she was a female. Mons was drowned. Conrad Grebel, they called him, and they did it a little bit different with him. They used something called the widow's sister. I don't know why they call it the widow's sister, but that's what they called it. And this was this machine they would put you in, Larry, and they just squeeze you, and it'd squeeze you so much that blood would start coming out of your eyes and ears and all this kind of stuff. And then after they put him on the widow's sister, they put him on the rack. I guess after you've been like that, you need to be kind of stretched out so that. And they asked him, "Do you persist in this heretical belief of believers' baptism?" And he said, "Yes." And then they kept stretching him a little bit, and finally he changed his mind. That he was wrong and everything, and so he went to uh, Zwingli. Wanted to introduce him to the congregation, that this guy had seen the light, and everything. And he asked him to get up and preach. And so Conrad Grable got up and started preaching believers' baptism again. And so they took care of him that time. And he didn't preach anymore. Okay. So, again, I think, I'm not defending them, but these reformers, why did they not go further than they did? They didn't want to lose the support of the government, because that was what was, as long as they were within the protection of the government, they didn't have to worry about getting on the rack or the widow's sister or something like that. Now, one thing that happened, in the Moravians, did I tell you they were very strict, and then the Mennonites, we're going to talk about all these groups. And one reason that brought about the Mennonites was the Munster Revolution. Munster, 1533, 1535, it greatly damaged the Anabaptist cause. It was not typical of Anabaptist views, but Jan Mathies, a Haarlem baker, decided he would bring about the millennium by force. So he took over Munster, and he called it the New Jerusalem. And radicals from all over Europe flocked to the city and drove out the dissenters. And they ran the city until the Catholics and Lutheran troops joined together in 1535 and captured the city, and they put a stop to that. And even to this day, in Reformed churches, they will point to this like this is typical of the Anabaptists. This was the only time you had something like this. But they'll make it like it's the typical thing. Have you ever seen people do that sort of, make one guy does something, and they say that's typical of the whole movement, And so as a reaction to that, there was a guy by the name of Menno Simons, and he became a leader in the Anabaptist movement, and he stressed pacifism. And so that became a cardinal point of doctrine for the Mennonites, which came out of the Anabaptist movement. Okay, and we still have Mennonites today. We have a lot of them out in western Oklahoma.
A lot of them local that you just don't recognize
as. This was a Mennonite. This building, which of course it's been added on to a lot since. It was started as a Mennonite church right here. So now and out of the Mennonites came the Amish. Okay, because they thought the Mennonites were getting too liberal.
That's what I said. Not necessarily
and so I had this student in my class, one of my classes, and she was a Mennonite, and I was talking about Oklahoma history. I was talking about Western Oklahoma and Mennonites. And she said, yeah, and somehow she said the Amish, they think we're all a bunch of liberals. It's hard to imagine the Mennonites as a bunch of liberals, but that's what they think. German Protestantism is established. There were doctrinal differences that hindered a common Protestant front. But the Augsburg League was formed in 1531, which kind of stopped the Zwingli movement after Zwingli got killed, remember, at the battle in Switzerland. And so Germany became more Lutheranistic type of Protestantism. Now, one of the things that kept the Catholic Church from being snuffing this stuff out is they couldn't agree with each other, okay? Because Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of France, Francis I, they were always fighting each other. And so this was historic. And I think about what I just said. The Holy Roman Empire, what country came out of the biggest country that came out of the Holy Roman Empire? Germany and France. Okay, so they couldn't agree. You probably have heard Germany and France have had some differences over the years, and so that kind of helped the Protestants survive in Germany, and eventually they came up with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where equal rights were granted to Catholics and Lutherans within the Holy Roman Empire. Each prince would then determine the religion of his own territory. And they came up with an agreement. If you didn't like what the king's religion was, you would be allowed to sell your possessions and move to another territory. So we had a lot of movement of people. If you've ever done any genealogy and family history, and you have any German ancestors, you'll find these people moving. You think, why did they move? This was a lot of it right here. They wanted to move to an area where they could freely practice their religion. The Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden largely adopted Lutheranism as the state religion. So that's another thing the Reformers never really got away from, was an official religion of the country. And if you don't like it, you could leave, type of attitude. Any questions so far? Now that brings us to John Calvin. And it is estimated that at the time of the American Revolution, probably 2/3 of American colonists held to some form of Calvinism. So he was really impactful. He was born in 1509 in France. He studied at the University of Paris and the University of Orleans, studied law, and apparently he didn't have much religious fervor at all. This is page 5. Is everybody with me on page 5? He studied Greek and Hebrew, and according to him, in 1533, he had a sudden conversion to Christianity. He expressed sympathy for Martin Luther, which got him jailed. And it's because France was a very Catholic country, and they're not going to put up with that. So he left France and went to Switzerland in 1534 because they were a lot freer. Okay, probably the freest. It's all relative, freest part of Europe, and so he taught that salvation was all of grace, and man neither initiated nor could he resist salvation. He saw there were 3 divine institutions: the church, the sacraments, and the civil government. The church was the elect of God, according to Calvin. He adopted the Anabaptist views on each congregation would choose its own officers. And there were only 2 sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper. And then he began writing what is called the Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. Now this book is about 1,000 pages long, and it's in our library at the college, and I have to confess I've never picked it up and just read the whole thing, but it was revised. He revised it over the years, and the final edition was published in 1569. And he really didn't create new doctrines, particularly in this. This was more what we call a systematic. In other words, he just covered everything. Okay, it's not that he created this idea here, but he would write about it and cover it and examine it and expound on it and everything like that. He was a very popular preacher. He was a Bible lecturer in Geneva, and then he became a pastor with a huge influence over the city council. Now, he never held any political post, but he was kind of like the puppet master, if you will, of the city council. Nobody wanted to offend John Calvin on the city council. He was really had a lot of influence. But then, as it sometimes happened, he lost influence and they kicked him out of Geneva. Then they invited him back. 1541, I guess sometimes people kick you out and then 4 years later they'll ask you back. I don't know. Maybe that happens. But Calvin organized a church with 4 officers: the pastor, who would lead public discussions and exegesis. Now, what that means is simply just explaining the scriptures. What does this mean? Then you'd have a teacher who would be over the Geneva school system. Because, see, the way he looked at it, it'd be a whole lot easier to get these people in the right way if you get them when they're really little, okay? And you start teaching them. And then the deacons would care for the poor and supervise the local hospital. And then finally, the heart of Calvin's ecclesiastical system were the elders. And they would really rule the church, okay? They would conduct ecclesiastical discipline, including excommunication if somebody needed to be kicked out. The congregation may pick the officers, but once they pick them, they'd run the show, okay? And singing had a place in worship, just like it did in the Lutherans. And he thought of Geneva as a model of perfect Christian community. The city council passed laws against fighting, swearing, drunkenness, and card playing. Have you ever known people that thought card playing was sinful?
My grandparents would not play cards, but if you transform that into a hard little thing with dots on it,
yeah,
as a domino,
oh yeah,
no problem.
But this is where it goes back to, is John Calvin said card playing was sinful. Why was it sinful? Because you should be spending your time reading the Bible instead of idle amusement. I wonder what he'd think about video games. See what it led to, once you let the card playing go on. And I remember when I was a little kid that I was over at a friend's house, and I think we were playing cards, and his father came through and he was talking to us, and he said something about poker. And he said, I don't think it's right to play poker on Sunday. And that made an impact on me because I've never played poker on Sunday, ever since. And I thought that had to be wrong because this guy said it was. And now let's talk about some things that's not very, very positive about John Calvin. Okay. There was a guy named Miguel Servetus. And he was quite an intellectual guy. He discovered the pulmonary circulation of blood. He was the Spanish author of De Trinitatis Erroribus. I'm having a hard time pronouncing that, but basically he rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. And he believed that Jesus was pretty special. He was the Son of God. Okay, and all that. He died for. He believed in almost every cardinal doctrine of Christianity except the Trinity, and he didn't believe in infant baptism. So the Catholics didn't care for him, so he decided he'd come to Geneva, okay, in 1553, and he had criticized Calvin because he didn't, he wasn't going far enough, okay, and so John Calvin he shows up in church service with Calvin's preaching, and he looks out there, and there's Michael Servetus out in the congregation. He was arrested at the end of the service and convicted of heresy and burned at the stake, October 27, 1553. Now, Calvin never personally burned anybody at the stake, but his people did. It's estimated, I think, like 50 people were burned at the stake. Now, I don't understand that. Maybe there's some people on Facebook I'd like to burn at the stake. Some of their opinions and all that. Not really, but that is what and of course, what is Calvin most associated with is the doctrines of predestination and election. According to Calvin, God chooses who's going to be saved. And how do you know you're part of those that have been chosen or the elect? If you live a life of good works, you have a good work ethic. And so we talk about the Protestant work ethic. One thing that really was important in early America, I told you 2/3 of colonists were probably Calvinists to some extent, is that they believed that. Americans worked hard, because they wanted to be prosperous and have the sign of the elect. And all that sort of thing. And now, what about people that God did not choose for salvation? He had a word for them. They were called the reprobate, and they were left to their own sin. And now, after Calvin died, from Calvinists, well, not after he died, but from Calvin then came some denominations that were, it wasn't like Luther, has the Lutheran Church. What happened was several churches, denominations, were heavily influenced by Calvinism. Does anybody want to name one? No, not Methodist. Presbyterian. Congregationalists. We talked about the Separatists, okay? The Dutch Reformed Church. The Huguenots. Now, they were in France. They were French Calvinists. And probably one of the more famous French Calvinists whose family came to America, and he was famous in the American Revolution. If you've ever heard of Francis Marion, he was the Swamp Fox, in South Carolina and so forth. And then the University of Geneva would train Reformed ministers. He was succeeded by a guy named Theodore Byas. And a lot of the things that we attribute to John Calvin was Theodore Byas. They said he was more Calvinistic than Calvin. I mean, have you ever talked to anybody that they get one point of doctrine and they just, that's all they want to talk about? Usually it's this like predestination stuff. Another one is, the works of the Spirit. Another is the end times. And all those things are important. But some people, that's all they want to talk about, And so Theodore Byas, well, he just really, he was more Calvin than Calvin, but he had a more moderate personality. Where Calvin was kind of, you don't agree with me? Look at that. We got a stake right over there, that type of thing. So anyway, that's the Calvin. Does anybody have any questions on that?
So Calvin required works.
He required works as an evidence of your salvation.
As an evidence. Okay, so if you didn't have a chance to do works, such as the man on the cross, keep on the cross, it had still occurred. You just didn't have a chance to do evidence.
I guess that's right. Of course, I think he gave evidence by his,
by his remember name.
yeah, but, when I say, oh, what, it changes something, you're changed, and so on. Yes, sir. Peasants are voting what? Yes, yes, all around that same time, and that's what I said last week was you can't look at Christian history in a complete vacuum because everything influences everything else, and so on. Anything else? Okay, now let's go to England, the English Revolt. Now, I want you to notice every one of these Protestant movements are a little different, aren't they? And and came about differently. In England, because they are separated from the continent by 21 miles of water, they kind of developed a little bit different. There was more patriotism probably in England than just about anywhere else. But here the kings had long controlled episcopal appointments. In other words, they appointed the bishops, the archbishops. That Rome didn't do that. They were, they ran the show. But one thing was because the kings were so favorable to the Catholic Church, they could get away with it. Chief political posts were filled with churchmen. Now, why did the kings usually pick a church official? Because they tended to have more learning, and experience. But as we come into the 1500s now, remember John Wycliffe? I think I mentioned him last week, that he'd been long dead. Okay, he'd been dead for over 100 years, but he had still had followers in England. Now they weren't legal. They met in secret, and they were called the Lollards, and so on. So now we have come to the throne a man by the name of Henry VIII. Married to the widow next door. She'd be Henry. Okay. So he was king from 1509 to 1547. He was well read in theology. He was very popular in the country, and amazing as many people as he had killed. But he made Cardinal Thomas Wolsey Lord Chancellor, and that was his right-hand man, Cardinal Wolsey. And Thomas More was another one. And obviously, Thomas Wolsey was a devout Catholic, wouldn't you think, since he was a cardinal? Thomas More was a devout Catholic. Henry VIII was a staunch Catholic. And in fact, when Martin Luther did his thing in the Holy Roman Empire, Henry VIII, who was very literate, he was a scholarly guy and all that, he wrote the Assertion of the Seven Sacraments, which was a condemnation of Martin Luther. And it was such a strong defense of the Catholic Church, the Pope gave Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith. Now, later, they'll probably want to take that back, as it turns out. Now, Henry, he was not expected to be the King of England because he had an older brother named Arthur. Henry VII, his father, arranged a marriage between Arthur and a Spanish princess called Catherine of Aragon. Okay, all right. Now, who was her parents? Anybody know? Ferdinand and Isabella, that had financed Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492. And the reason that that Henry VII wanted his son to marry a Spanish princess was because what did England and Spain what did they have in common? They didn't like France. Okay? So they were going to try to work together. And now what that did, though, Scotland, which England had been trying to dominate for a long time. You've probably seen Braveheart and Mel Gibson thing. Well, Scotland was an ally of France because they didn't like England. So here's all this going. Well, Henry VII is able to get his 15-year-old son, Arthur, married to 14-year-old Catherine. Now, Arthur and Catherine go off for a honeymoon. They don't make it back. He dies. Arthur dies of an illness, sudden illness. And so now here's this. Think about this. 14-year-old girl can't speak. She could not speak English when she married Arthur. So I guess they had to communicate some other way, Dave. I don't know what it was, but so here she is. She can't speak the language. She's in this country, but Henry VII came up with an idea, and he talked to Ferdinand and Isabella about it in Spain. He said, "Look, I've got another son. He's 8 years old. Let's let Catherine stay here in England. Let him grow up, and when he gets a little older, they can get married." And so that agreement was made. And so Catherine lived in England. She began to learn English and English ways and all that. So when she was in her 20s, she married Henry, who was like 17. Okay. And he apparently thought this was a great idea. Okay. At first. So when Henry VII dies, Henry VIII becomes king of England. Now, in order for Henry to marry Catherine, the Pope Julius II, had to give what is called a dispensation. Why? It was against Catholic law to marry your brother's widow that was considered incestuous. So, why did he give the dispensation? Because the testimony was that, yes, they were married, but he died before the marriage was consummated. I wasn't there, so I don't know, okay? But, so what is the most important thing that the king's wife is supposed to do? Produce a son. They had 6 children. 5 died in infancy. And Mary was the only one of the 6 children to survive infancy. And he was concerned that England would never accept a woman ruler. And he was of the Tudor dynasty. You may have heard of the Tudors. And they really had a very tenuous claim to the throne, because I'm not going to get too much in the weeds here, but you go back several years, 50, 60 years, whatever it was, and the king at that time had died, and his widow married again. Okay. So, see how this goes. So she married a Tudor who had been her Duke of the wardrobe. His job was to take care of the queen's wardrobe. And so they already knew each other. So she married him, and they had children. Okay, so you're following me. So they have a claim, but other people are in line first, right? Before their descendant would ever get to the throne. But then they had the War of the Roses. It's fought for control of the English throne. And finally, Henry VII, that we talked about, emerged as the King of England. He kills the previous King of England from the other side of the War of the Roses, and he becomes the king. So it's a real thin claim to the throne, and so he's afraid she doesn't produce a son, he's going to have a rebellion. He became increasingly dissatisfied with his Spanish wife. He publicly insulted her. He said, "I'm sick and tired of my Spanish cow." That doesn't really help the marital relationship much, but he so he starts he see how to put this. Henry was never all that faithful to begin with, okay, and so in fact, there was this Mary Boleyn became his mistress and had his child, and it wasn't like a kept secret or anything. It's kind of like, if you don't like it, too bad, type of thing. And but then Mary had a younger sister that Henry had never seen, because they had sent her away to live with some relatives in France and get cultured and educated in French culture and all that. And her name was Anne Boleyn. And while she was in France, remember the French Huguenots, the French Reformation was going on, and she became very influenced by those ideas, and apparently she became an evangelical Christian in France. So she comes back, they give her a job. Her job is to be a lady in waiting. Now, what in the world is a lady in waiting? You wait, you're a noble lady who waits on the queen. And as such, she's around the court, isn't she, all the time? And guess who notices her? Henry VIII. And so he had these string of mistresses, so he proposed to her that she would be his latest mistress. And she refused. She said that would be a sin. You're married. And in fact, so he pursued her for 6 years, tried to convince her, and he would force her to be at court and sit next to him and all that kind of stuff. And one night, Larry, they had musicians would come in and played, and Henry wrote music. And he wrote this love song. And the musicians played the love song, and everybody cheered. Oh boy, what a great music it was, and all that. And he turns to Anne Boleyn and he says, "Anne, if some young man wrote that song about you, what would you say?" And she said, "I would ask him how his wife liked it." So you can see she's trying to avoid this. Okay, so finally, she says, "I cannot marry you. You're married. I cannot be your mistress. I would marry you if you were not married, but I'm not going to be your mistress." He thought of an idea. Here's this young woman. Catherine's not giving him any sons. And he said, and so he says, "I'm going to divorce Catherine. Will you marry me?" And she says, "Well, if you're no longer married to Catherine." And then he says, "I want a son." And Anne Boleyn says, "I promise I will give you a house full of sons." Don't make a promise that you cannot fulfill. Because now they sent this to the Pope to annul the marriage with Catherine. On what grounds?
Not providing sons.
He said, conscience has begun to trouble me that she was married to my brother, and God has punished me by not giving me a son. So we want to annul the marriage. And so Clement VII, the Pope, refused the annulment, and Wolsey was sent to Rome to try to get the Pope to annul the marriage. And the Pope wouldn't do it because her nephew, Charles V, remember him, Holy Roman Emperor, was in control of Rome at the time, had soldiers there. So now, has anybody ever seen the movie Anne of 1,000 Days? Okay, that movie is a slander on Anne Boleyn. It makes her look like she was a real loose woman and everything. But I've told you, she refused for 6 years to be his mistress. Okay, so why did she eventually marry him? Because she felt like if she married him, she could have influence over Henry to, to accept these Protestant evangelical ideas. And she did. She got him to allow the printing of the Bible in English. And as long as there was a possibility of her giving him a son, he listened to what she had to say. He is very favorable. He never got it. So what they did is he appoints a new archbishop, the head of the church in England. His name was Thomas Cranmer. Now, he was a professor at Cambridge, and he suggested to Henry to seek the theological opinion of the universities, all the theologians, and they opined that it would be okay. Okay, so it's okay, and so he married Anne Boleyn secretly in 1533. And she was able to get a copy of the open Bible to be on a desk at court for all to read. And the Great Bible was published in 1537 at her urging. Now, what was the Great Bible? It was a Bible in English. And the reason it's called the Great Bible because it was printed really big, so people could read it and everything. Not too many people bought the Great Bible, though, because that was pretty big to lug around and everything, but it was there. So that answered the question. I hope it's Thomas Cranmer. He said it's fine. He nullified the marriage to Catherine, and Princess Elizabeth was born in September of 1533. When Henry came into the room and they said, "Your Majesty, you have a daughter," he expressed his disappointment, and he was about to leave, and Anne said, "Won't you kiss your daughter?" And he says, "I will when she has a brother." So this was pretty. So the Pope excommunicated Henry. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which made the king the supreme head of the church in England. Now, at this point, it's not the Church of England. It's just the church in England, because they still considered themselves part of the Catholic Church. The Pope had no say. Okay, and so several monks were executed for opposition. A couple of his friends, Bishop Fisher and Thomas More, were beheaded for opposing the Act of Supremacy. More was replaced by Thomas Cromwell, and he advised the king to confiscate church property, because there's a lot of wealth there. And he advised Parliament to pass the Bill of Attainder Act. Now, what that was Parliament could sentence somebody they could have a trial of a citizen or subject, I guess, and convict them. They could act as a court, is what I'm trying to say. And so, in our Constitution, that is forbidden for Congress to pass acts of attainder. Congress cannot uh, pass judgment on anybody. That's a court function. We have that separation of powers, and it goes back to this. Interestingly, after Cromwell fell out of favor, guess who was convicted on a bill of attainder? It was Thomas Cromwell, the very act that he had urged them to pass. Well, Catherine died in January 1536. Not too awful long after that, Anne Boleyn is beheaded in May of 1836 on a charge of adultery. Historians are almost universally of the opinion that she did not commit adultery, but she gave birth to another child born dead. It was a boy born dead. So now he's ready to find another woman who will give him a son. And they did have testimony from, remember, Elizabeth was the daughter. She had a music teacher, Mark Smeaton. And they charged her with committing adultery with Mark Smeaton. And he did confess. He confessed at first when they said, you committed adultery with the queen. He says, no, I didn't do that. They put this rope around his head and they tightened it, and it just started squeezing. They called it a memory jogger. It kind of helped him remember. And so he did give testimony in court. They charged her of committing adultery with her own brother. I mean, just outlandish type. A ruler would ever try to use the legal system against opposition, but it did happen, okay? 11, do what now? Yeah. 11 days after the execution of Anne Boleyn, he marries Jane Seymour, who was really young. He figures she's got lots of time to give me a son. And she got it right the first time. She gave him Edward, but she died in childbirth. Okay. Now you think, well, that's the end of the English Reformation, isn't it? Because Anne Boleyn's dead. But the Seymours were also Protestant. And Jane Seymour had brothers who became very influential with Henry. And he really liked Jane Seymour because she had finally given him what he wanted, a son. And, William Tyndale had left England in 1524 because he didn't like the Catholic stuff in England, and he goes to Geneva and in different places, and he comes back. Eventually, while he's in Geneva, he translates the New Testament into English, and eventually that is allowed in England to be to be distributed in England. It's interesting that a leader of the Catholic Church in England found out who the printer was, and he went to him and he said, look, we will buy every copy that you've printed of Tyndale's Bible, so they could destroy the Bible. Now, why did the Catholic Church want to destroy the Bible? Because they said people might read the Bible and get the wrong idea about Catholic doctrines. So they bought all these copies and burned them. The printer told the Tyndale people about this, And he used all that money he donated so they could print more Bibles. So they wound up having more Bibles than what they had had before. Okay. Finally, they caught Tyndale, and they burned him at the stake. And his last words were, "Dear God, open the King of England's eyes." So, after Anne Boleyn is dead, the Seymour family, remember Jane Seymour, and that's not the actress. You've probably heard of Jane Seymour, the actor. That's a different person, okay? But the Seymour family supported Protestantism, and Henry drafted the 10 articles that he hoped would unite England on religion. And you can see there some of the things that were part of it: the Apostles' Creed, the Bible, the Nicene and Athanasian creeds, the first 4 councils, about the sacraments. There were only 3: the justification by faith in Christ. They put out the Christ is physically present in the supper. So you notice that Henry's kind of taken kind of the Lutheran type, because they were heavily influenced by the Lutheran deal, but they rejected the Bishop of Rome, the Pope's power to deliver anyone from purgatory. Okay, so he's kind of, and the Church of England eventually develops out of all of this. Okay, at first it was just the church in England. Eventually it's going to become the Church of England, the official established church. And because the Church of England was not founded on any particular religious belief, what was it founded on? Henry wanted a divorce. Okay, and the rulers of England they tried to keep the people united, and so they were kind of in between on everything. And today, what is the church in America that's the successor to the Church of England? Does anybody know? The Episcopal Church. And, the Episcopal Church is kind of in between Protestant and Catholic, and that's kind of the way the Church of England was at that time. And so, just quickly here, they started translations of the Bible just started coming out. The Tyndale, Coverdale, the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments were taught in English. So they revised them down to 6 articles because they were afraid that Spain and France were going to invade England. And so he did make some compromises. And one important one is, now remember, Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Okay, so Henry is a single man now. So now Thomas Cromwell, his advisor, says, what we need to do is you need to marry a Protestant princess. And Henry says, okay. He says, I'll go to Europe and try to find you one. He said, well, I'll tell you what. Take Hans Holbein with you. Now, who was Hans Holbein? He was an artist. And Hans Holbein would paint a portrait of this girl. And so in Cleves in Germany, there was this ruler. He had a daughter that he had been trying to get rid of. She was 30 years old. He wasn't able to get her married off, so he bribed Hans Holbein to kind of touch her up a little bit in that portrait. So Henry gets it, and he signed the marriage contract. He goes, get her over here. And so when she shows up, he's looking for this woman that's in the portrait, and they say, Your Majesty, this is Anne of Cleves. And he looks at her and he says, oh my God, no. but he had the contract. He had to go through with it because he needed this Protestant alliance. So he married her, but they annulled the marriage, and he gave her. He made a deal with her. She have a little house and servants, and she'd be taken care of, and she went with that. What happened to Hans Holbein? He was tortured to death. Thomas Cromwell was executed for treason for his role. Well, it's time for Henry to get a fifth wife. Now every one of these is kind of talking about it relates to our Christian history because of what's happening. His fifth wife was a first cousin to Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard. She was really young, and he was kind of getting on up there. He was 47 years old. Now, that's not all that old in today's standards, but Henry was in bad shape. He ate too much. They said he could eat a whole chicken himself. And when he was younger, he was real athletic, played tennis and all that. And he liked to go hunting, but they would take more than one horse to go out hunting because he'd wear a horse out. He was so heavy and had to help him up. And by the time he marries this 22-year-old woman, they said his breath was so foul you could smell it across the room and everything like this. And he went on a hunting trip and he came back earlier than she expected, and he caught her with another guy. And so she was beheaded for adultery and treason. So he marries a sixth wife, Catherine Parr, and they're married 4 years, and she's a young woman too, but he dies in 1547, and so she survives him. Okay. And she was also Protestant. So you see what's happening here is that these women are playing a huge role in moving England further into the Protestant camp. Now, why is that important to this whole thing? Think about what if England had not gone Protestant? Would the Protestant movement have survived? I don't know. It would have been more difficult, no doubt about it. And so with the death of Henry, there were three parties in England. One supported the king in keeping doctrine and worship while opposing foreign control. The Catholics, who wanted the Pope back into direct control, and Protestants who favored greater reform. So you've got three different factions now in England. Remember Edward, the son of Henry? Edward VI, he was only 9 years old when he becomes King of England. And so they set up a regency council led by Jane Seymour's brother, who was the Duke of Somerset. He was a strong Protestant, and he was a believer in religious and political liberty. And in 1547, Parliament voted to give the cup to the laity. They had taken away. See, what they did is they would give the bread to the congregation, but the priest would drink the wine for the whole congregation. They figured that was good enough. Well, they gave it back to them. And so now they began to shift back more to the Protestant. The 6 Articles were considered too Catholic. Priests could marry now in England. The Book of Common Prayer was made a requirement in the churches, which was largely the work of that university theologian, Thomas Cranmer, remember him, on how to conduct various services, and they did it in English, not in Latin. Now, Somerset's running the country. Remember, he's the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour. And so he's wanting to advance the Protestant cause. So he tries to arrange a marriage of the young king with a Scottish princess named Mary. So, but an invasion of Scotland, uh, defeating the Scots at the Battle of Pinkie. I don't know why they call it the Battle of Pinkie yet. I need to figure that out. But this caused the Scottish nobles to betroth Mary to the heir of France, Francis II, and so that idea didn't work. So anyway, Somerset's going along pretty well. He's telling Edward pretty well what he ought to do, and Edward's just a kid, so this is his uncle, so he's pretty well letting Somerset make the big decisions. But then Edward dies of tuberculosis at 16. So that's going to cause a problem, because who were Henry's kids? Remember, he had 3 children. Remember who they were? The first wife was Mary. By the second wife was Elizabeth, and the third wife was Edward. Edward's dead. That leaves 2. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Mary, the daughter of Catherine, the Spanish cow. Okay? All right. Well, who's going to be next in line? Well, the Seymour family, they wanted the throne they wanted to bypass Mary, Elizabeth, and Mary, Queen of Scots, in favor of a daughter-in-law, Lady Jane Grey, who was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister. Put her on the throne. She's only 16 years old. She did not concoct this plan. I don't know if she even agreed to it. But now all of England is in an uproar. Who's going to be the next ruler? The city of London, however, rallied to the cause of Mary. To make a long story short, her forces defeated and beheaded all these Seymour family people, and executed Lady Jane Grey for treason. The poor girl hadn't done anything other than just be named queen. And so Mary, when she comes to the throne, she is an angry woman. Now, why is she angry? She's bitter. Her mother had been cast aside, remember, in favor of Anne Boleyn, and then you got Jane Seymour, and so she's a devout Catholic. She doesn't like all these changes that have taken place. So what does she do? She repealed all the Protestant changes, jailed Cranmer, remember him, he's the archbishop. Then she married a cousin who was the heir to the throne of Spain, Philip II. That was very unpopular. Now, I want you to think about this. Why do you think her marriage to a Spanish heir to the throne of Spain would be unpopular in England? Well, in that day and age, who did they think usually ran the show in a marriage? The guy. So they figured he would run the show, so they'd be really being ruled by a foreigner, right? That was an unpopular marriage, and they never had any children. Parliament restored the authority of the Pope. Persecution of Protestants began. Bloody Mary, as she came to be known, was on the throne for 5 years, during which she burned over 300 Protestants at the stake, including Cranmer, the archbishop. He was told to either recant or be burned at the stake, so he did sign a document recanting everything that he had done. And they said, we're going to burn you at the stake anyway. And so as they were getting the fire, getting it ready to start going, he reached out and with his right hand, he put that in the fire. He said, this is the only part of me that should burn. The part of me that signed that document, you know. And so Mary then dies, and Philip II, he goes back to Spain. And Mary dies in 1558. They think she probably had cancer of the ovaries. Okay. And there wasn't really much they could do for you back in those days. And which left the throne ultimately to her half-sister, Elizabeth. Now, let me tell you just a little bit about Elizabeth. This poor girl, think about what her childhood was like. She was just a few years old when her mother was beheaded. She really didn't know what happened to her mother. But she was around the court, and one day, all these people were around, and Henry was there. And Elizabeth says, Father, what happened to my mother? And Henry decided he didn't want her asking any more questions. So he sent her to live with at first the fourth wife, the one Anne of Cleves, and now eventually after Henry dies, she moves in with her stepmother, the last wife, okay, along with Mary and Edward. They all lived together for a time. So, and I think that we're about to run out of time here, but Elizabeth, I think, has kind of been unfairly treated by history. They said she was not strongly religious. Well, think about the times she lived in. What would happen if you expressed the wrong view? Look how England went back and forth and everything like that. There for a while, it looked like Mary was going to have her executed. And so she tried to keep her mouth shut, okay? And then she grows up she lives with her stepmother and the sixth wife. And this eventually, when Elizabeth is 14 years old, she gets a letter in the mail from the Duke of Somerset. Remember Seymour's brother? Proposing marriage. He's a grown man, and she's 14 years old. And she writes him back. She's very flattered for his interest, but she says, I'm only 14 years old. I don't think I should be taking a husband at this point in time. Well, eventually, a year or so later, he can't get Elizabeth, so he marries the widow of Henry VIII. And so she's living with her mother, and now her stepmother, and now she's living with her stepfather, who had asked her to marry him. I've got some interesting things to tell you about that situation, but I'm going to wait till next week. Hopefully, it'll make you come back next week. Okay. You kind of see where this is going. Okay. And why Elizabeth didn't want to take a strong position on religion. Okay, that's all I've got to say about that. I guess somebody needs to come and turn off the... all right. I do appreciate y'all coming. I thought after 19 last week we would have at least a dozen